man's wife, will he be? Oh, wow.
I'm sorry. Hold on a minute. Okay.
Okay. If a man divorces his wife and she goes from him, becomes another man's wife, will he return to her? Would not that lamb be greatly polluted? You have played the whore with many lovers, and would you return to me, declares the Lord? Lift up your eyes to the bare heights and see. Where have you not been ravished? By the waysides you have sat, awaiting lovers like an Arab in the wilderness. You have polluted the lamb with your vile whoredom. Therefore the showers have been withheld, and the spring rain has not come. Yet you have the forehead of a whore. You refuse to be ashamed. Have you not just now called to me? My father, you are the friend of my youth. Will he be angry forever? Will he be indignant to the end? Behold, you have spoken, but you have done all the evil that you could.
Thank you. So that was Jeremiah chapter 3, verses 1 through 5. As we go into our lesson, we're talking about the idea of Judah playing the harlot. And we mentioned before that idolatry is compared to adultery because Israel was married to God, and she, by committing idolatry, it's like somebody running around on their husband, basically. So he says in verse 1, if a man divorces his wife and she goes from him and becomes another man's wife, will he return to her? Will not that land be greatly polluted? You played the whore with many lovers. Would you return to me, declares the Lord? The original language begins verse 1 with the phrase, they say. The word lamor means to utter. So it actually reads like, they say if a man divorces his wife and goes with him. That's how it actually reads. It goes all the way down to the word polluted. They say, if a man divorces his wife and she goes with him and becomes another man's wife, will he return to her? Would not that land be greatly polluted? And so what's happening here is God is appealing to that which is common knowledge in the land. It's like saying, they say such and such, so is it reasonable for him to take her back? That's the idea. This is what's being said. Would such a guy take her back? The phrase where it says becomes another man's wife, that phrase man's wife isn't there in the Hebrew text. It is better read as if she has been to another man. That's how it reads. It actually reads she's been with another man. And so a key to understanding that passage is in the first few words. It says, if a man divorces his wife. In the Old Testament, a valid reason for divorce was to find something indecent or unseemly in a spouse. Although Jesus will later say that legally permitted divorce was because of hardened hearts, that is in the Old Testament. In the New Testament, he allowed for divorce because of sexual immorality, which was punishable by death, not divorce in the Old Testament. So you have two ideas here. Deuteronomy, we'll go there to chapter 21, and we'll compare it. We'll see how it applies to our text to Matthew 19, the words of God through Moses versus the word, along with the words of Jesus Christ. So if we look at Deuteronomy, oh, is that correct? Let me see. Why didn't it come up? Okay, can someone read that, please? Verses 1 through 4, chapter 24.
When a man takes a wife and marries her, if then she finds no favor in his eyes because he has found some indecency in her, and he writes her a certificate of divorce and puts it in her hand and sends her out of his house, and she departs out of his house, and she goes and becomes another man's wife, and the latter man hates her and writes her a certificate of divorce and puts it in her hand and sends her out of his house, or if the latter man dies, who took her to be his wife, then her former husband, who sent her away, may not take her again to be his wife after she has been defiled, for that is an abomination before the Lord. And you shall not bring sin upon the land that the Lord your God is giving you for an inheritance.
Thank you. So here in Deuteronomy, we see the Old Testament is basically forbidding the idea of getting married to someone who you divorced before. If she gets married again, then she comes back to you, that you don't marry her. It says there in verse 1, it says, she finds no favor in his eyes because he's found some indecency in her. The Hebrew doesn't make clear what that indecency is. I know that it is not fornication or adultery, because in the book of Deuteronomy, adultery is punishable by death, not by divorce. Right? We have to remember that. The rest of the Bible is still true, that they're putting adulterers to death. Right? And so whatever this indecency is, the word literally means something scandalous, or could mean something along the line of, how do I put it? Along the line of something disgusting, right? If we look at Deuteronomy chapter 23, we get a bit of a hint here. And that's just one chapter back. And this is down verses, let's see. Hold on a minute. Verses 12 through 14. I'll read this. It says, you shall have a place outside the camp, and you shall go out to it. And you shall have a trowel like a small shovel. You have a trowel with your tools, and when you sit down outside, you shall dig a hole with it and turn back to cover up your excrement. Because the Lord your God walks in the midst of your camp to deliver you, to give you up to your enemies before you. Therefore, your camp must be holy, so that he may not see anything indecent among you and turn away from you. And of course, this is talking about the natural call of nature to relieve themselves, and they would go outside the camp, dig a hole, and the hole basically became the toilet. Then they had to cover it up. God says, because I don't want to see that stuff. That's what he's saying. It is indecent. That word there for indecent is the same word he uses in chapter 24, where it says he finds some indecency in her. And that's why I said it carries the idea of something disgusting about it, whatever it is, right? He writes a bill of divorce and he sends her away, and she goes off to be with some other man, marry somebody else, who writes a bill of divorce and sends her away. If she comes back, it says, don't marry her because you'll pollute the land if you do that. The other text I wanted to share was in Matthew chapter 19, 3 through 9. We'll see some comparisons and some contrasts. I'll give you some historical things to consider about this. That's interesting. Trying to get this to come up right. All right. Can someone read this, please? Chapter 19, 3 through 9.
And Pharisees came up to him and tested him by asking, is it lawful to divorce one's wife for any cause? He answered, have you not read that he who created them from the beginning made them male and female, and said, therefore, a man shall leave his father and his mother and hold fast to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. So they're no longer two, but one flesh. What therefore God has joined together, let no man separate. They said to him, why then did Moses command one to give a certificate of divorce and to send her away? He said to them, because of your hardness of heart, Moses allowed you to divorce your wives, but from the beginning it was not so. And I say to you, whoever divorces his wife, except for sexual immorality, and marries another, commits adultery.
Thank you. So there's a little bit of differences here, right? The background, the reason why the Pharisees came up to him, because they're divided into two camps. There was a liberal camp that was headed up by a man named Hillel, and a more conservative camp headed up by a Pharisee named Shammai. And basically, Hillel had the point of view that word we talked about earlier when we read through Deuteronomy, he finds some indecency in her. that word could refer to anything he didn't like. It could be a mole or blemish in her skin. Shammai held no something more serious than that. No, what like you said, we said it wasn't adultery, it wasn't fornication, because had it been that, she would have been stoned to death. That was the law, right? But it was something short of that, but it was still something that was pretty bad, whatever it was. And I use that's why I compared it to Deuteronomy chapter 23, where the same word is used to describe human waste, right? But it's something that was kind of disgusting, whatever it was. But they come to Jesus and they ask a leading question: is it lawful to divorce one's wife for any cause? And Jesus appeals to the book of Genesis, and he reads about how everything was set up in the beginning. The idea here is the way set up in the beginning is the way God wants it to be. And so he says, he concludes it in verse 6. They are no longer two but one flesh. Well, therefore God joined together that no man separate. And then they said to him, and they're mentioning here Deuteronomy chapter 24. Why then did Moses command to give her a divorce and send her away? Why is that in there? And he says, because your hardness of your heart, God allowed you to divorce your own, right? So a reason for divorce in Deuteronomy was for finding some indecency, but God only let that happen because the people wouldn't forgive each other. They were just hard-hearted. Then it goes on, he says, and I say, verse 9 to you, whoever divorces his wife except for, and here's the word here, sexual immorality. That word is porneo, and it refers to any sexual relations that doesn't involve a man and his own wife or a woman and her own husband. Any sexual relations outside that relationship is simply fornication. That's the word. The fornication is a name for a broad range of sexual sin, right? It could include seeing somebody that you're not married to and you're married. It could be two single people having relations with each other. It could be same-sex couples doing it. It has to be two spouses, and in the Bible, he made them male and female. So it's very clear what these spouses are. That's Jesus said that in verse 4. He made them from the beginning, male and female, right? And they were husband and wife. Outside of that relationship, any other sexual relationship, anything you could ever imagine is simply sin. As Tony Evans would say, without nuance, without exception. It's simply as that. If you want to know, is some sexual relationship sin? The question is, are they male and female married to each other? If the answer is no, then the answer is yes, it's sin. Very, very easy to answer the question. But you notice he says, if you get divorced except for immorality, that's fornication. And marry another, commit adultery. In the Old Testament, fornication is punishable by death. Jesus is still living under the law, but they couldn't put people to death because the Romans wouldn't allow it. By this time, under the Roman rule, in order to put somebody to death, they had to go to Pontius Pilate. And basically, the Romans rule basically was, if it doesn't affect the empire, well, you don't do it. That's why they went to him to have Jesus put to death, because you got this rule, we can't do it, And he knew that rule, and so he made a ruling where you know the story. He avoided the whole thing by saying, "I find no guilt in him," and then he tried to make it this thing with Barabbas. The rest of the crucifixion story. But the whole idea was, by and large, Israel could no longer be self-determined. She couldn't determine her own laws anymore. She had to do everything under permission of Rome, and so the death penalty becomes divorce in Jesus' day. They could still do that, and that's the reason why we allow for divorce for fornication. Had we still been under that Old Testament law, the person would have otherwise simply been put to death. And divorce is a kind of death, more it's the death of a marriage, right? So Jesus mentions that. In the Old Testament, he finds some indecency and he sends her away. But if she comes back, he doesn't marry her again, right? In the New Testament, somebody commits adultery, and that's the only reason he allows for a divorce in the New Testament. All right, so we go back into our lesson. Let's see. If we go back into our lesson, I have here that the law will prevent her return. That's what Deuteronomy 24, 2-4 says. That will cause the land to be defiled. If she were not married to the other man, then he would not take her back because she played the part of a harlot. So either way, if he divorced her and she went away and she married someone, he couldn't take her back. If he divorced her and she went away and she lay with someone without being married, as a text I mentioned before suggested in this book, that phrase, she married somebody else, isn't there in Hebrew, but it simply reads, if she goes to another man and comes back. He simply wouldn't take her back, right? That's the reason why it says, they say if a man divorces his wife and she goes from him and becomes another man's or goes to another man, right? Will he return to her? The idea is, will he take her back? That's the idea. The answer is, well, no. No one thinks that's reasonable, right? And he's making a point here about the nature of Judah. She's like that faithless wife that was sent away. She went off to other people. Now she wants to come back, more or less. Judah was already guilty of idolatry, right? We talked about how they worship various false gods. Moreover, when she learned about the Babylonian coming invasion, she didn't turn to God to help. Jeremiah chapter 2, verses 6 and verses 8 talks about that. Can somebody read that, please? Verse 6.
They did not
They
say
did
where
not
the Lord.
say,
Go ahead.
they did not say, where is the Lord who brought us up from the land of Egypt, who led us in the wilderness, in a land of deserts and pits, in a land of drought and deep darkness, a land that none passes through, where no man dwells.
You might recall when we talked about this and the trouble started up, they didn't seek God. They didn't say, where's the Lord? That seems like a question you would ask if you really follow God, that when trouble happens, you ask, where's the Lord? They didn't say that, right? Someone read verse 8, please.
The priest did not say, where is the Lord? Those who handle the law did not know me. The shepherds transgressed against me. The prophets prophesied by Baal and went after things that do not profit.
Okay. And so that's, again, the leaders there are not seeking God. We go to verse 36, and I'll read this. It says, how much you go about, we did this last week, changing your way, you'll be put to shame by Egypt as you were put to shame by Assyria. They sought help from the Assyrians, and they were going to seek help from the Egyptians. And God says that's not going to work. The point here being, they're not seeking God at all, right? They aren't seeking God at all. If we go into our lesson again, it says she didn't turn to God for help, but turned instead to Assyria in Egypt. This is the picture of the woman wandering from her husband, going from place to place to place, rather than coming to her husband. He says in verse 2, lift up your eyes to the bare heights and see, where have you not been ravished? By the wayside you sat awaiting lovers like an Arab in the wilderness. You polluted the land with your vile whoredom. The heights or the hills were witnesses of their idolatry. You might recall the Asherah poles were in the hills, right? Where they went up to worship the fertility goddess. And so they were witnesses. The term ravished, that literal term means to lay yourself down. And so it's actually intensive. It's more like, where have you not laid yourself down? You know, who didn't you sleep with? That's the accusation God is to that question. It's a very intense question. Is there any place you did not commit idolatry? You know, he compares their common idolatry to like an Arab in the wilderness. The Arabs at that time were nomadic people in the desert, much like the Bedouin are today. So Judah's idolatry was as common as finding nomads in the wilderness. You know, does a nomad live in the desert? Well, the answer is yes. In the same way, you guys are committing adultery. That's the picture there, right? he said, and I have here, as we've seen throughout the study, God uses unfaithfulness in marriage as an example of idolatry. God presents himself as the aggrieved husband whose wife has been committing adultery. The grievance language born of jealousy reminds us of Exodus chapter 20 and Proverbs chapter 6. And let's go there for a minute. Let's see. I'll make that shorter. Will someone read Exodus 20, 4 through 6, please?
You shall not make for yourself a carved image or any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, or that is in the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the sea. You shall not bow down to them or serve them. For I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children to the third and fourth generation of those who hate me, but showing steadfast love to thousands of those who love me and keep my commandments.
Thank you. And so he warns them about idolatry. This is the second commandment. The first commandment is you shall have no other gods before me. Second commandment is you shall not make any idols. Don't make any carved images representing me, right? He says, don't bow down to them. Don't serve them. For I'm the Lord your God is a jealous God. That's the language of an aggrieved husband, to be jealous, right? Visiting the iniquity of the fathers of the children of the third and fourth generation of those who hate me. Then he says, but showing steadfast love, the word chesed in Hebrew is a Old Testament word that's akin to the word agape in the New Testament. It's more than just selfless love. It's covenant love. This kind of love, God expects something, right? You know, we only say it's selfless because the people did nothing to earn it. However, it's covenantal in the sense that what they didn't earn was being in covenant with God, right? But once they're in covenant with God, he expects them to behave like a wife, that marriage covenant. He expects them to behave that way. In the same way, you know, when Christ marries us, he didn't do it because we deserved it. But now that we are his bride, he expects us to behave like his bride. So there's a consequence in the case of Judah or Israel for breaking covenant, even though it is unearned, even though it's selfless. People often think that because God's love is selfless, there's no matter what you do, there's no consequence. That's actually not, they don't understand a covenant when they say that, right? But he says he's a jealous God, and he will visit the consequences of the sin for generations and generations of those who hate me. Look at Proverbs 6, 32 and 35. Can somebody read that?
He who commits adultery lacks sense. He who does it destroys himself. He will get wounds and dishonor, and his disgrace will not be wiped away. For jealousy makes a man furious, and he will not spare when he takes revenge. He will accept no compensation. He will refuse, though you multiply gifts. Thank you.
Now, so he's warning someone about committing adultery with someone else's wife, because that husband will be furious. He will not care about what you do, right? He's coming after you. That's the idea. That's what jealousy does. It makes a person furious. It makes them angry, okay? And God says that he is a jealous God, and a warning about not committing idolatry. So I have here that in that context, the Proverbs passage is a warning against adultery. So just as people play fast and loose with marriage, that is, they don't take it seriously enough, so Judah played fast and loose with the relationship with God. Are there any questions? Any questions at all?
I'm thinking about Hosea.
Yeah.
Yeah. And her not being put to death.
Yeah.
Or really divorced.
Yeah, and what he was showing, of course, the story doesn't end like that, but what he's doing is through Hosea, he's showing Israel what he's going through.
Right.
Because she keeps being unfaithful, but eventually he does send Israel away. They do get taken away by the Assyrians. So Hosea talks about deals with God's grievance, right? And that's the warning part. By the time you get to Jeremiah, warning's over. They're done. They're done. And so Hosea tells the beginning of when he first starts warning them. But when we get to Jeremiah and Ezekiel, they're done. He's putting her away. And that's what happens when he sends them away. He actually uses that language with Israel. Are there any other questions? All right. I have here in a little subtitle, unsuccessful chastisement. Therefore, the showers have been withheld and the spring rain has not come. Yet you have the forehead of a whore. You refuse to be ashamed. If we look at Leviticus, and I'll kind of read through this. Leviticus chapter 23, 1 through 20. So he says, verse 1, speak to the Lord saying, or the Lord spoke to Moses saying, speak to the people and say to them, these are my appointed feasts of the Lord. You shall proclaim holy convocation, my appointed feasts. Oh, wait a minute, is that where I am? Yeah. Maybe that's not where I am. Hold on a minute. That's not where I am. Well, I lost the place. I'll find it. Give me a moment here. That should have been Leviticus 26. So he says, chapter 26, verse 1, you shall not make idols for yourselves or erect an image or a pillar. So he starts off with talking about idols. You should not set up a figured stone in your land or bow down to it. I'm the Lord your God. You shall keep my Sabbaths and reverence my sanctuary. I'm the Lord. If you walk in my statutes, observe my commandments, and do them, then I will give you rains in their season, and the land shall yield its increase. The trees of the land shall yield their fruit. If you go down to verse 18, in the same chapter, he says, and if in spite of this you will not listen to me, I will discipline you again sevenfold for your sins. I will break the pride of your power. I will make the heavens like iron and the earth like bronze. That's the idea of drying it up. No, iron is not wet. And your strength be spent in vain. Your land shall not yield its increase, and the trees of the land shall not yield their fruit. Right? He's warning them that if they sin, he will stop the rain. That's the idea there. For an agrarian culture, withholding rain meant disaster. Crops would not grow, and famine will soon come upon the people. Who knows what 1 Kings 17:1 says? Anybody have an idea? He was the prophet with the mantle.
Was that where he caused no rain?
That's right. Who was that?
Elijah.
That was Elijah, right. Elijah went to Ahab and told him there won't be any rain until I say so. God gave him that kind of power. He stopped the rain for 3 years, right? Without rain, you don't have crops. You know, one of the things that made the Great Depression so bad in the United States that during the time of Depression, a big drought had hit, and a lot of tops have been washed away as it dried out. So not only did people not have jobs, but food became scarce, became very expensive because a lot of crops didn't grow. They died in the drought. He also mentions the woman's forehead. He says, "You have the forehead of a whorish woman," how it reads in Hebrew. That's a picture of stubbornness. When the Bible mentions sometimes about a person's face or a head, it's referring to their stubbornness. In this case, it's a stubborn refusal to repent. In other cases, it can be a stubbornly preaching of the word of God. We go to Isaiah 48 and Ezekiel 37. Let's see. Can somebody read Isaiah 48:4?
Because I know that you are obstinate, and your neck is an iron sinew, and your forehead brass.
Thank you. He begins with the word obstinate, right? He's dealing with the whole bit about, iron sinew or sinews aren't made of iron. This doesn't know what I'm saying. You're stiff-necked and you have a hard head, right? That's what stubbornness is. How about Ezekiel chapter 3, 7 through 9? Anyone?
But the house of Israel will not be willing to listen to you, for they are not willing to listen to me, because all the house of Israel have a hard forehead and a stubborn heart. Behold, I have made your face as hard as their faces, and your forehead as hard as their foreheads. Like Emery, harder than flint have I made your forehead. Fear them not, nor be dismayed at their looks, for they have a rebellious house.
Thank you. And so what he says here on the first part, he says, Israel is stubborn. They won't listen. They have a hard forehead, a stubborn heart. Then he says, but I made your face as hard as theirs, and your head as hard as theirs. You're going to be just as dogged, just as stubborn, just as hard-headed as you keep preaching my word. No matter what they say, no matter how they look at you, no matter what they do, keep preaching what I say, Ezekiel. That's what he says. He compares it. He says, like emery is harder than flint. Emery is that rough stone, and flint is another rough stone. When you strike them together, it makes a spark, right? He says, I made your forehead like that. So don't be afraid of them. Don't worry about how they look at you, right? You preach. You just do what I tell you. You warn them, and you preach, you preach, you preach. The preacher does not have the luxury of preaching just what people want to hear. That's called itching ear preaching. But he must preach whatever God says, no matter what people think about it. And many times they won't like what he has to say. But God tells him to preach anyway. You tell them what I tell you. And he faces a lot of trouble from God if he doesn't do it. The point I'm making here, though, is the idea of the forehead representing, at least in these cases, stubbornness, right? And so he's saying about these people, they are like prostitutes running after other gods, and they stubbornly refuse to repent. Are there any questions there? Any questions at all? So he says in verses 4 and 5, this is under presumptive sin. Have you not now just called to me, my father? You are the friend of my youth. Will he be angry forever? Will he be indignant to the end? Behold, you have spoken, but you have done all the evil that you could. There are two things, he says, the person says. Will you not from this time cry out to me, my father? You are the guide for my youth. The other thing the person says is, will he be angry forever or hold on to the end? In these two questions, there's an assumption that God will relent. God will change his mind about what he says he's going to do. People in rebellion often rely upon God's grace to forgive. Now notice I'm saying it like that way. I said people in rebellion rely upon God's grace to forgive. In their minds, sooner or later, God will let go of his grievances against them. Now God does let go if a person repents, but this is a person who's not repenting. They are even quoting Psalm 85:5. They are taking the scriptures and they are throwing it back at God. Psalm 85:5. Let's go there real quick. Says, will you be angry with us forever? Will you prolong your anger to all generations? That's the question that the psalmist asked, right? The sons of Korah, the sons of Korah are pictured here. But they don't have the sincerity of the musicians who wrote the psalm. They're quoting it, they don't mean it, which is why God says, but you've done all the evil you could. You're doing all this stuff. There's no real repentance. They talk about God forgetting their sin, but they keep sinning, right? If we go to Isaiah 58, all of that talks about the nature of a fast. Now, Israel was good for fasting. Here's a general essay question. Did God honor Israel's fast in Isaiah 58? If you recall the passage. Is this the fast I have chosen?
No.
Right. Why didn't he honor their fast?
Because their deeds were evil.
Right. They were still sinning. They weren't repenting of anything. They kept doing the thing that they were always want to do. Right. Just get a chance. That's a long chapter, but just read Isaiah chapter 58. You'll see the idea that just because someone is doing some physical work or something that looks like they're being contrite doesn't mean they actually are. We go to the other passage over in Hosea. Oh, I got to shorten that off again. He says, come, let us return to the Lord, for he has torn us, that he may heal us. That sounds nice. He has struck us down. He will bind us up. After 2 days, he'll revive us. On the third day, he'll raise us up, that we may live before him. Let us know. Let us press on to know the Lord. He is going out as sure as dawn. He will come to us like the showers, as the spring rains upon the earth. But then God says, what shall I do with you, O Ephraim? Now, Ephraim was a name for the northern kingdom of Israel. What shall I do with you, O Judah? Your love like the morning cloud, like the dew, it goes away early, right? So they're talking a good game, but it doesn't last. Just because they say it doesn't mean it's real, right? He says, the morning clouds dissipate. Sometimes you can wake up in the morning, you can see a light layer of fog on the ground. And by the time the sun gets high in the sky, that fog is gone. It burns it away, it's just gone. Dew doesn't stay on the ground all day long, right? Someone read Hosea 7:14.
They do not cry to me from the heart, but they wail upon their beds. For grain and wine they gash themselves. They rebel against me.
Thank you. So he says they don't cry to me from the heart. They cry up on their beds, and for grain and wine they gash themselves, they cut themselves. You understand? This is a pagan practice. That's a pagan practice. Even while they say they're crying out for God, they're actually crying out for false gods, cutting themselves, flagellation, that kind of stuff has nothing to do with God, right? This is the thing that the prophets of Baal would do when they were in the contest with Elijah. They cut themselves, they beat themselves, right? God doesn't require that at all. That's something that people engage in false worship do. There are some people who name Christ who do it, but they're engaging in a pagan practice. And that's why Hosea is mentioning it like that, right? They don't cry from the heart. They're cutting themselves. It has nothing to do with me, whatever it is they're doing. I have here in the lesson that note that cutting oneself in prayer was a pagan practice. All right. Are there any questions? I have my own to ask if you don't have any. Okay, class. Define adultery.
Adultery is any relationship outside of marriage that is between a man and a woman. Any sexual fornication outside of marriage that is
Right.
not between a man and a woman that have married to each other.
Yeah. Now, an adultery in particular deals with the one who's married committing the sin. Fornication is a general class of sins that are sexual. Okay. Define idolatry.
Worshipping other gods.
Yeah.
It's like,
Right. Worshipping other gods. In which way is idolatry similar to adultery?
You're putting something false before what should be true, before what's actually true.
Okay. And why does he make the comparison? Why is it always compared to two?
Is that
I mean,
both
idolatry.
rebellion?
Say again.
Will it be both rebellion?
They're both rebellion. But what else? I mean, if I commit rebellion, or if my wife commits rebellion against me, she might not be committing adultery.
Following
all adultery is rebellion, but not all adultery is rebellion. I mean, all adultery is rebellion, but not all rebellion is adultery in terms of marriage, right? So I'm asking the question, which way is idolatry similar to adultery?
desiring after
After what?
some God, something, some man, some woman outside of God, and God's
Yeah,
rebellion.
it's similar to adultery in the sense that adultery is someone who's unfaithful to their spouse. Idolatry is a person unfaithful to their God, to God, right? So you're going after a false God. That is like spiritual adultery. That's the whole lesson here. He's comparing Judah to a prostitute. She's committing adultery against him. Okay, so that's the similarity. I'm trying to get really, I know we tend to get heady as Christians. This is a very, very basic thing. The very basic root answer here is adultery is unfaithfulness in a marriage. Idolatry is unfaithfulness in our relationship with God. One's with our human spouse, the other's with our God, right? Let's look at Exodus chapters 20 and also chapter 34. Can someone read chapter 20, verse 5, please?
You shall not bow down to them or serve them, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children to the third and fourth generation of those who hate me.
Thank you. Can I get someone to read Exodus 34, 11 through 14?
Observe what. Oh, go ahead.
Observe what I command you this day. Behold, I will drive out before you the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites. Take care lest you make a covenant with the inhabitants of the land to which you go, lest it become a snare in your midst. You shall tear down their altars and break their pillars and cut down their asherim. For you shall worship no other God, for the Lord, whose name is jealous, is a jealous God.
Thank you. So we remember those two passages, go back into our questions. And the question is, why does God call himself jealous? Isn't jealousy a petty emotion? I mean, have you ever heard that jealousy is a petty emotion?
No.
You never heard that?
You're jealous when something else is taking the place of you.
Yeah. And so why does God call himself jealous?
God says you should have no other God before you, which means he wants to be first and foremost in your life.
He wants to be the only one in your life, right? The only thing you worship. Right. So when a husband gets jealous or a wife gets jealous because their spouse is playing around, that is actually righteous at that time. It's not being petty. They are rightfully jealous. The word literally means anger and passion, right? They are rightfully so. If someone is not wild to anger when their spouse commits some sin against them, something's wrong with that relationship already. You know what I mean? It is not reasonable for a spouse to say, "Oh, I don't care what he does." That doesn't make any sense. If you love the person, you should have cared what they do. You care what they do. It matters what they do. And you don't want them giving attention to someone else they should be giving to you if you're married to them, right? And that's the idea. That's what jealousy is. We read that proverb. If you commit adultery against another man's wife and that man shows up, your pleading will not help you. He is rightfully angry, jealously angry. So it's not a petty emotion in this case. It can become petty if you're jealous of somebody's stuff. Oh, he got a bigger house than me. Well, that's just silly, right? coveting, that's a kind of greed. But this is what we're talking about. In this case, jealousy is reasonable. It's reasonable for God to be jealous when He's commanded us not to worship other gods, and we do. But we say that we would have relationship with Him. Okay. In this lesson, this was multiple choice. In this lesson, biblical reference to one's forehead means being happy,
No.
No,
having a headache,
no,
No.
having a high IQ. No, like the cartoon Dexter with the giant forehead.
no.
Being stubborn.
Yes.
Why was withholding rain a terrible punishment for Judah? Multiple choice. No rain meant to dry heat. They like the weather humid.
No.
No rain meant no crops. We could lead to famine.
Yes.
How about no rain meant they couldn't fill their pools to go swimming?
There you go. No.
No, right. Okay. True or false? God is gracious.
True.
That's true. True or false? God's grace means that unrepentant sin is okay. After all, He won't stay mad forever.
False.
That's false. That's that Romans 6 tells us, right? Shall we continue in sin that grace may abound? Of course not. Right? Doesn't make any sense. May it never be. How are we who have died to sin keep living in it? He actually answers that question. People think I'm saved by grace, therefore it doesn't matter how I live. It does matter how we live. Are there any? Oh, here's one last question. True or false? If you listen to this one, the sentiment, I know God's on my side, He's been with me since I was a child, is being expressed by people today, even while they continue in their sin.
True.
True. I hear it all the time. People say, I know God's with me because He was with me back when I was. They go through the whole childhood of times God has saved them from various situations, but they're continuing in sin as if God is with them in their sin. Right? That's the same idea that Judah said, you've been my friend from the time I was young. And I'm calling upon you. And God says, you're talking a good game, but your speech is like a morning cloud that disappears in the middle of the day. Right? Any other questions? Well, that's it for our Bible study today. We're about to start our prayer meeting. If you're on YouTube and you found this video or this lesson helpful, then please like the video and subscribe to our channel for easier access to future lessons. After the video, you can also join us in prayer by clicking on the link I provided in the description below. But if you cannot join us, then thank you, and I'll see you in the next lesson.